Today we have this beautiful reading, this beautiful encounter of Jesus with the woman at the well, speaking of us, of our faith, speaking of what God promises to us when that encounter happens in our lives. This journey of Lent that today's readings all speak about is that encounter. It reminds me of what Pope Francis said in the Joy of the Gospel. He says that Jesus invites all Christians to renew that encounter with Christ. But in Pope Francis speaking about that invitation, he takes in the next words a step back, inviting us to openness, an openness to that encounter, a preparation to meet Christ in our everyday lives, and the joy of that encounter. And what that really entails, according to Pope Francis, and what we see in our readings, is that openness in that encounter to be known, that openness to be known by Christ. Not only to know Christ, but to rather receive him. To receive that gift of love, that mercy that Jesus always brings to us, if we are but open. There's something within us, and I believe it's the way that we were created. The need that we have to be connected to one another, and that need to be connected principally to our God. God made us that way. God made us to only find fulfillment in life, contentment in life, through that connection to one another, and always in that connection with God. And our readings speak about that. In the first reading, we have the story of the Israelites who had just witnessed the mighty of God, the power of God, rescuing them from the most powerful army on the face of the earth. They were slaves in Egypt. They saw how God rescued them, destroyed the armies, and led them into the desert. But it didn't take long before they were grumbling. They had lost that openness that they received, or that they had rather, when they began that journey. It's a hard life in the desert. They were not sure where the next meal, where the next water would be coming from. They were thirsty. They were uncomfortable. It was a difficult life. And that transition in our lives, that transition from slavery to freedom, from being caught up in sin to be living in grace, is often a difficult transition. There's some temptations to go back. There's that temptations to not only to live in that inner freedom that we've received from Christ when we've been forgiven. So really that journey that lasted 40 years, that distance on a map isn't that far. They could probably make it in a month or two. But it took them 40 years to learn to be open. It took them 40 years to learn to trust in God, to put aside the ways in which they identified themselves as slaves, the way in which they did not want to depend on God, the ways in which they kept wanting to go back to that slavery. And that's our journey. That's our story. Oftentimes in our lives, when we're freed, when we're forgiven, we hold on to certain things. We don't let them go. We don't let them go. And therefore, we're never truly free. Sometimes it's just not being open to receive that love and that forgiveness of God. We hold on to instead that, I don't deserve this, I'm not good enough. Or maybe I can't forgive that person because he's not good enough. But what did St. Paul say in the closing of the second reading? Did Jesus wait to send his son when we were perfect, when we earned it? He didn't. In our sinfulness, while we were still sinners, Jesus died for us. He came to our rescue. And so it gets back to what Pope Francis is saying, do we have that openness to receive that gift? And that's where we find ourselves with Jesus in that encounter at the well. Because we too are that woman. We too come to that well open in that dialogue with Christ, but not always understanding or quite maybe open enough to receive that great gift that he wants to give us. Our lives can sometimes be looking for that water that truly never satisfies. Sometimes, like that one, we can focus so much on our own emptiness, our hurt, our pain, our struggles, we can't see beyond them. But yet, if we're open in an encounter with Christ, Christ always invites us deeper. Invites us deeper to that living water that he gives, to his Spirit that gives us true life, allowing us to walk in freedom in his life. Maybe one way I can illustrate that was an experience I had when I was on retreat about 1.5 years ago. And I was in Ontario doing an Ignatian retreat, an 8-day retreat. It was a beautiful place in Guelph, Ontario, and on the one side of the retreat center, actually they had quite a bit of farms and forest. On one side they had a stream, beautiful stream, living water, and just a very beautiful place to go. And so the first day, that's where I found myself, sitting there by the stream, just taking in there's something about living water, doesn't it, that refreshes us, that helps connect to our desire for God. Well, then a few days later, I went to pray on the other side of the farm, deeper into the woods, and I found a bench, and didn't have a very successful time of prayer. Just caught up in myself and caught up in my own worries and preoccupations. So then I looked in front of me, and what was I sitting in front? A puddle. That kind of hit me like, right in the heart. That there's a choice between living water and this puddle, and that puddle kind of represented in my life all of those things that I was going after, or maybe not going after, living my life in a superficial way at times. In prayer, going through the motions, never really slowing down enough to listen to the voice of God. In my everyday life, looking at all those things that I had to do, and just trying to find time to do one more thing, fit it in, get it done. And I can go on and on about how that was, at that time in my life, kind of a representative, not entirely, but very, very real moments in my life. My stubbornness, not being open to God. My own wanting to control, not trusting, getting caught up in worries, etc., etc. And so when we focus on that, sometimes we don't find that living water. We look to our own resources, and that's all we have, where Jesus says, no, come to the living water. It doesn't run out. It's always there. But it takes that openness to that encounter. It takes us that desire and that willingness to slow down, to listen, to be in dialogue. Isn't that what we call prayer? Prayer that is much more than going through the motions, but slowing down, listening, being in a relationship with Jesus, listening to his voice. The opportunity to open the Word of God. I invite you to do that today in chapter 4 of John's Gospel, to reflect on this beautiful reading. Where do you find yourself in it? Let God speak to you in his Word. Maybe it's the opportunity next weekend for the Emmaus retreat, where we can deepen that experience with Jesus and his Word. Maybe it's that encounter that Jesus had with this woman, who, according to the societal and religious norms of the day, they were completely separated. Men and women didn't talk to each other at a well. Jews and Samaritans avoided each other. Now Jesus broke through that. What about the conflicts that we have in our families and in our world? Do we just accept them as they are, or do we do something to encounter one another in a new way, in a way that reconciliation and unity can happen? There's a lot of work cut out for us. But it begins in that openness to God who speaks to us, that gives us his water. Jesus, who invites us today at this table where we are fed in his body and his blood. So let us go forth this week. Let's go forth to be refreshed in that living water. Not to look in the scarcity of where that water might be, but the abundance of the living water that comes only from Christ.